Carla Walker, a 17-year-old junior at Western Hills High School in Fort Worth, Texas, was a petite girl standing just under 5 feet tall. She had long, honey blonde hair that cascaded over her shoulders, capturing attention wherever she went. Carla was known for her friendly and kind-hearted nature, which made her popular among her peers. She was dating Rodney McCoy, a kind and energetic young man who was the quarterback for the school's football team. Rodney was known for his polite demeanor and reliability. Together, they made an admired couple. Carla often confided in her friends about her dreams of marrying Rodney one day and attending Texas Tech University together to build a future filled with promise. On the evening of February 16, 1974, Rodney arrived at Carla's home in Benbrook to take her to the school's Valentine's Day dance. It was a special event, and Carla had spent hours preparing, wearing a dress that highlighted her youthful charm. The dance concluded around 11:30 p.m., and afterward, Rodney and Carla decided to prolong the evening by inviting another couple to join them for a casual drive along Camp Bowie Boulevard and the Benbrook traffic circle. The four teenagers stopped at several popular teen hangouts, including Mr. Quick, a burger joint, and Taco Bell. They laughed, shared stories, and enjoyed the carefree atmosphere of the night. After dropping off the other couple, Rodney and Carla decided to visit Brunswick Ridgely Bowl, a nearby bowling alley that stayed open late. Carla mentioned she needed to use the restroom, so Rodney waited in the car. Moments later, as Carla returned and climbed into the passenger seat, a horrifying incident shattered the night's tranquility. The passenger door suddenly swung open. Before Rodney could react, a tall man with short brown hair appeared, wielding a pistol. Without warning, the man struck Rodney on the head with the butt of the gun. The force of the blows left Rodney dazed and bleeding. During the assault, the pistol's magazine ejected, scattering bullets across the parking lot. The attacker grabbed Carla and began pulling her out of the car. Despite his injuries and blurred vision, Rodney faintly heard the man say, "You're coming with me, aren't you, sweetheart?" Carla, clearly terrified, shouted at Rodney, "Go get your dad!" Barely conscious and in immense pain, Rodney managed to drive to Carla's house around 1 a.m. He veered onto the lawn and braked abruptly, causing a commotion that startled everyone inside. Carla's family, including her parents Leighton and Doris Walker, were still awake, enjoying a late-night game of dominoes with relatives. Carla's younger brother Jim, aged 12, and her older sister Cindy, aged 18, were in the living room watching television. The family rushed to the door when they heard Rodney frantically knocking. Blood dripped down his face as he cried out, "They took her! They're going to hurt her badly!" Leighton, a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel, wasted no time. He grabbed his pistol and drove straight to the bowling alley, hoping to find any trace of Carla. Meanwhile, Doris called the operator on the family's rotary phone, asking to be connected with the police. Officers arrived promptly at the scene. In the bowling alley parking lot, they found Carla's purse and the pistol magazine left behind during the struggle. Law enforcement officers immediately began searching the surrounding area, hoping to uncover more clues about Carla's whereabouts. Over the following days, the search for Carla intensified. Local authorities, aided by volunteers, combed through Fort Worth and its outskirts. Patrol teams used binoculars to scan remote areas, helicopters flew overhead, and trained dogs sniffed for any trace of Carla. Investigators also visited Western Hills High School, where they interviewed students and staff. They examined photographs taken during the Valentine's Day dance, searching for unfamiliar faces or anyone who might have seemed out of place. Students were questioned in hallways and classrooms, with detectives asking if anyone knew of a person who could have harmed Carla. Despite these efforts, the investigation yielded little progress until 4 days later. On February 20th, 1974, two police officers patrolling a secluded two-lane road near Benbrook Lake, approximately 5 miles southwest of Brunswick Ridgely Bowl, noticed a drainage culvert made of concrete. Out of caution, they decided to inspect it. What they found was devastating. Inside the culvert lay the lifeless body of a young woman. She was lying on her back, her face and neck marked by deep scratches and severe bruises. It was Carla Walker. Forensic investigators concluded that Carla had been strangled. Since there were no ligature marks, they believed the perpetrator had used his hands to kill her. The discovery of her body sent shockwaves through the community. Carla's vibrant life had been cut tragically short, and the brutal circumstances of her death left everyone reeling. News of Carla's tragic death dominated the front pages of local newspapers, including the Star-Telegram. Her funeral was held at the Western Hills Church of Christ, where over 1,250 mourners gathered to pay their respects. The small sanctuary was overwhelmed by the outpouring of grief and love from friends, family, and community members. Carla's death was not just a loss for her family, but a tragedy that deeply affected everyone who knew her. In the weeks and months that followed, the community continued to mourn and seek justice for Carla. Authorities worked tirelessly to track down leads and identify her killer. Carla's story became a somber reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of protecting one another. Though decades have passed since that fateful night, her memory endures in the hearts of those who loved her. Fort Worth officials established a dedicated task force of detectives from the regional police department to investigate Carla's case. However, the team faced significant challenges. No fingerprints were found on Carla's body or clothing. The blood on her dress belonged to Rodney, a result of his head injury. While traces of bodily fluids were discovered, the technology to identify individuals through DNA was not yet available. In that era, there were no surveillance cameras, parking lot security systems, or license plate readers along the highways to assist in tracking suspects. To gather leads, the task force set up a 24-hour tip line at the Central Police Headquarters. Officers sat behind metal desks, sipping warm coffee as they listened attentively to citizens naming individuals they believed could be responsible. The detectives received numerous calls, with theories ranging widely. Some suggested that Carla's life had been taken by a couple involved in marijuana trafficking, a festival worker at the Fort Worth Stock Show and Rodeo, or even a quiet young man often seen bowling in the alley where Carla was abducted. Others shared accounts of a boy who reportedly argued with Rodney at Mr. Quick Hamburgers the night before the dance. The detectives also enlisted the help of a hypnotist in an attempt to extract more details from Rodney, who had suffered a head injury during the incident. Under hypnosis, Rodney recalled one critical detail. The kidnapper wore a cowboy hat, either brown or tan. However, when the hypnotist snapped his fingers to bring Rodney out of the trance, Rodney broke down in tears, overcome with grief for failing to save his girlfriend. In their meetings, the task force detectives discussed another unsolved case that had occurred almost exactly a year earlier, on February 7, 1973. On that night, a young woman named Becky Martin failed to return home after attending an evening class at the South Campus of Tarrant County Community College. Her body was discovered nearly 7 weeks later, so badly decomposed that determining the cause of death was impossible. The medical examiner speculated that Becky may have been stabbed, strangled, or even shot in the abdomen. What piqued the detectives' interest most about Becky's case was the location where her body was found, inside a drainage culvert just outside the city limits. 2 girls, 2 drainage culverts, and 2 cases separated by a year. It seemed too coincidental for the investigators to ignore. Though they refrained from making public statements, the detectives began considering the possibility of a serial offender. By March, a month after Carla's death, the task force's investigation relied on a small but significant lead. Detectives learned that the magazine clip found in the bowling alley parking lot belonged to a Ruger .22 caliber pistol, a relatively new model at the time. They reached out to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, ATF, requesting a list of anyone in Fort Worth who had purchased that specific firearm model. The ATF provided a list of several dozen individuals, and the task force began the painstaking process of interviewing each one. One name on the list stood out: Glenn McCurley, a 31-year-old truck driver. McCurley grew up in West Texas as the eldest of 3 brothers. During his teenage years, his parents sent him to the Westview Boys' Home in southwestern Oklahoma. This institution, funded by the Churches of Christ, advertised itself as a sanctuary for boys facing significant challenges. It was designed to provide care for those who had been neglected due to familial illness, boys requiring supervision, those who had violated the law but didn't need incarceration, and those who had been abandoned or abused. Details about McCurley's time at Westview remain unclear, including the reason he was sent there and how long he stayed. However, it's evident that his time at the home did little to improve his circumstances or character. As detectives delved deeper into McCurley's background, they began piecing together a troubling portrait. Despite his unremarkable life as a truck driver, McCurley's name would soon become synonymous with the harrowing events that unfolded in Fort Worth. At this stage of the investigation, the task force had little concrete evidence tying McCurley to Carla's case, but his connection to the Ruger firearm warranted closer scrutiny. Meanwhile, the task force continued their search for more evidence, all while dealing with the limitations of the era. Without modern forensic technology or digital surveillance, the detectives relied heavily on community input and traditional investigative methods. The tip line remained active, and citizens continued to share their suspicions, leading to countless dead ends, but also keeping hope alive for a breakthrough. The comparison between Carla and Becky's cases remained a haunting backdrop to the investigation. Both young women had vanished under mysterious circumstances, their bodies later discovered in eerily similar locations. The similarities raised troubling questions about whether Fort Worth was facing a pattern of crimes orchestrated by a single individual. Despite the obstacles, the detectives pressed forward. Their efforts were driven not only by a sense of duty, but also by the profound loss felt by the community. Carla and Becky were more than just victims. They were daughters, friends, and individuals with futures that had been cruelly stolen. The task force's commitment to uncovering the truth reflected a broader determination to ensure justice for these young women and to protect others from meeting a similar fate. The investigation into Carla's case, much like Becky's, was a testament to the resilience of law enforcement in the face of adversity. Although the technology and tools available at the time were limited, the detectives' dedication to solving these cases remained unwavering. For the families of Carla and Becky, the pursuit of justice was a painful but necessary journey, one that would forever shape the legacy of these young women and the detectives who worked tirelessly on their behalf. In February 1961, Glenn McCurley left the Westview Boys' home and traveled to Abilene, Texas, where his actions quickly spiraled into criminal activity. He stole a car, abandoned it, and then stole another vehicle. His reckless actions caught the attention of the State Highway Patrol, who began a high-speed pursuit. The chase ended when officers shot out one of his car's tires. McCurley attempted to flee on foot but was swiftly apprehended. In court, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. He was released in the spring of 1962 at just 19 years old. After his release, McCurley moved to Midland, Texas, where he met Judy Watson, a high school senior with blonde hair. On February 16, 1963, the two were married in a Baptist church. The young couple settled into a modest rental home, and McCurley soon found work as a truck driver for the U.S. Postal Service, running a route to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Judy later gave birth to 2 sons, Craig and Roddy. In 1972, McCurley relocated his family to a neighborhood in West Fort Worth. The McCurleys integrated into their new community, enrolling their sons in public elementary schools and joining Ridgely West Baptist Church. McCurley took on another trucking job, delivering precast concrete slabs to construction sites, while Judy worked at the church's child care center. Despite this semblance of a normal suburban life, McCurley's past and personality raised subtle red flags. A man who knew him once remarked on McCurley's habit of commenting on attractive women, often making remarks like, "Look at that one." In early March 1974, 2 detectives from the Carla Walker task force visited McCurley's home to question him about his Ruger .22 caliber pistol. When asked about the weapon, McCurley claimed it had been stolen 6 weeks earlier from his pickup truck while he was fishing. He voluntarily agreed to go downtown and take a polygraph test, which he passed. Satisfied with the results, the task force quickly removed McCurley from their list of potential suspects. By late spring of 1974, the task force had made little progress in Carla's case. Despite exhaustive efforts, concrete evidence was scarce, and investigative leads had dried up. As a result, the task force was unofficially disbanded. Many of the detectives were reassigned to other cases by their superiors. Even as the official investigation lost momentum, the Walker family's determination to seek justice for Carla never wavered. Strangers occasionally called their home, many anonymously, claiming to have information about the person responsible for Carla's death. Leighton Walker, Carla's father, took every call seriously. He meticulously documented each lead, writing down names and addresses of potential suspects and marking their locations on a map. He stored these notes in a metal box, no larger than a cigar case, as he refused to rest until the person who took his daughter's life was behind bars. Carla's younger brother, Jim, grew up with the weight of her murder shaping his teenage years. When he turned 16 and obtained his driver's license, Jim began assisting his father in their personal hunt for the culprit. On the anniversaries of Carla's death, Jim would often stake out the Brunswick Ridgely Bowl parking lot, searching for anyone suspicious. Meanwhile, he trained himself to be physically prepared for any confrontation with the perpetrator. Jim took up boxing at the Panther Boys Club, joined his high school's wrestling and football teams, and ran long distances through his neighborhood. "I wanted to be ready in case I ever came across the man who killed my sister," Jim later said. "My plan was to overpower him and take him somewhere remote, maybe out in West Texas, where no one could hear him scream." On February 19, 1977, nearly 3 years to the day after Carla's body was discovered, another chilling incident rocked Fort Worth. The lifeless body of June Ward, a 25-year-old registered nurse, was found by the side of a road in South Fort Worth. June was nude except for a bra strap wrapped tightly around her neck. She had been strangled and bludgeoned with what a reporter described as a heavy, sharp object. The detectives who had worked on the Carla Walker task force couldn't ignore the parallels between the two crimes. Both victims were young women, both were brutally attacked, and both cases carried an air of calculated cruelty. The similarities between June Ward's case and Carla Walker's case reignited lingering suspicions among the detectives. Although the task force had been disbanded, these seasoned investigators were haunted by the possibility that a serial offender was operating in their city. Despite the lack of physical evidence or witnesses to tie the two cases together, the striking parallels raised troubling questions. Could the same perpetrator be responsible for both murders? Or was Fort Worth tragically grappling with two separate predators? As the years passed, the unsolved cases of Carla Walker and June Ward left a scar on the community. For the Walker family, the grief of losing Carla was compounded by the lack of justice. Leighton Walker and his son, Jim, continued their pursuit of answers, driven by an unrelenting sense of duty to honor Carla's memory. While the official investigation had stalled, their private quest to find the truth underscored the depth of their loss and their unwavering commitment to bringing Carla's killer to justice. For the detectives who had been part of the original task force, Carla's case remained a painful reminder of the limitations of their era. Without modern forensic tools like DNA analysis or widespread surveillance technology, their ability to identify suspects was severely constrained. Nevertheless, their dedication to Carla's case reflected a broader determination to seek justice, even in the face of overwhelming obstacles. In the shadow of these tragic events, Fort Worth wrestled with the unsettling reality of unresolved crimes and the possibility that a dangerous individual remained at large. For the families of the victims and the detectives who sought the truth, the fight for justice was far from over. On July 9, 1980, the body of 19-year-old Denise Hogue was discovered just a few feet from Creek Bridge in South Fort Worth. Described in newspapers as an unemployed drifter, Denise had been strangled to death. The grisly nature of her murder shocked the community, but little progress was made in solving the case. 2.5 years later, in February 1983, another horrifying discovery was made. The body of Christy Tower, a waitress at the family-owned nightclub Billy Bob's Texas in the Stockyards, was found in a field north of the city. Christy's hands were bound with electrical wire, and a rope was tied tightly around her neck, mirroring the brutal methods seen in previous murders. Despite the similarities to other crimes, Christy's case remained an unsolved mystery. However, detectives received a strange tip just days after her body was found. Christy's purse had been discovered in a dumpster behind Cheers, a bar located on Champ Bowie Boulevard. This revelation raised eyebrows because Cheers was only half a mile from the Brunswick Ridgely Bowl parking lot, where Carla Walker had been abducted in February 1974. The proximity of these locations fueled suspicions of a chilling connection between the cases. As more women fell victim to eerily similar fates, public anxiety grew over the possibility of a serial killer operating in Fort Worth. These fears were exacerbated when Catherine Davis, a 23-year-old aspiring model, went missing on September 9, 1984. About a month later, on October 19th, Catherine's lifeless body was found in a field in far south Fort Worth. The discovery came as yet another devastating blow to a community already grappling with a series of tragic murders. But the horror didn't end there. On October 19, 1984, just 3 days after Catherine's body was found, the gruesome murder of 25-year-old middle school teacher Marilyn Hartman further deepened the city's dread. Marilyn was found in her bedroom, gagged and strangled, with her lifeless body bearing the marks of a violent struggle. Her death sent shock waves through Fort Worth, as Marilyn was known as a beloved and dedicated teacher in her community. The very next day, the nightmare continued. Cindy Heller, a 23-year-old recent graduate of Texas Christian University, TCU, and a former beauty pageant contestant, vanished without a trace. She was last seen near Hulen Mall, a bustling shopping center. Days later, her body was discovered in a creek bed on the TCU campus. Cindy had been strangled, her death adding yet another chapter to the growing list of young women who had met untimely and violent ends. The murders showed no signs of stopping. On November 26, 1984, Catherine Jackson, another local middle school teacher, was found dead in her own home. Her naked body lay in a bathtub with the water still running. She had been strangled with a rope, her life extinguished in a manner disturbingly similar to the other victims. Just 2 weeks later, yet another tragedy struck. The pattern of violence left the community paralyzed with fear, as residents became increasingly convinced that a serial killer was at large. Each new crime deepened the sense of vulnerability and horror spreading through Fort Worth. Women feared for their safety, and law enforcement faced mounting pressure to identify and apprehend the person, or persons, responsible for this wave of violence. The recurring elements in these cases were impossible to ignore. The victims were all young women, many of whom had promising futures. Most had been strangled, their bodies discarded in secluded or shocking locations. Some were found in their own homes, while others were left in fields or creeks, their dignity stripped away by the violent nature of their deaths. Investigators worked tirelessly to find connections between the cases, but the lack of forensic technology at the time hindered their efforts. DNA evidence, which could have provided crucial breakthroughs, was not yet widely available, leaving detectives to rely on traditional investigative methods. Tips poured in from the public, but many led to dead ends, adding to the frustration and despair surrounding these unresolved murders. As the years passed, the scars left by these tragedies only deepened. Families mourned the loss of their loved ones, their lives forever changed by the senseless violence. The community of Fort Worth remained haunted by the unanswered questions surrounding these cases, with residents left wondering who might be next. The specter of a serial killer cast a dark shadow over the city. Each anniversary of a murder served as a grim reminder of the lives cut short and the justice still denied. For the families of Denise, Christy, Catherine, Marilyn, Cindy, and others, the pain of their loss was compounded by the lack of closure. The killers remained at large, their identities a chilling enigma that haunted both law enforcement and the community at large. In the wake of these tragedies, Fort Worth found itself at the epicenter of a nightmare. The city's residents clung to the hope that answers would one day come and the killers would be brought to justice. But for now, the haunting specter of violence lingered, a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring pursuit of justice. Angela E., a 21-year-old part-time model and radio programmer for a rock music FM station, vanished after leaving her fiancé's home in southwest Fort Worth. The next day, her car was discovered abandoned along a highway in the southern part of the city. Days later, on the evening of December 22nd, her decomposed body was found in a field north of Fort Worth. The timing of the discovery, just days before Christmas, cast a somber shadow over the holiday season, further amplifying the community's anxiety. Another tragedy unfolded shortly after Angela's death. Regina Grover, also 21, was last seen leaving the Keg, a restaurant on Camp Bowie Boulevard, with her boyfriend. The following day, her lifeless body was discovered beneath a bridge in North Fort Worth. She had been strangled and drowned in a creek. Her boyfriend was found later that day in his apartment, brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt object. The twin horrors of these murders sent shockwaves through the city, leaving the community reeling and demanding answers. As the body count continued to rise, fear began to grip Fort Worth, particularly among women living in the city's southwest region. The murders seemed to target young women, and the violent nature of the crimes heightened public panic. Local media fueled the growing sense of unease, reporting on an unprecedented surge in the sales of guns and pepper spray. Many women, fearing for their safety, took proactive steps to protect themselves, and self-defense became a topic of urgent concern. In response to the mounting terror, the Fort Worth Police Department organized a free self-defense seminar. Over 3,000 people attended, the overwhelming majority of whom were women. The seminar offered practical advice and reassurance, but it also underscored the widespread fear that had taken hold of the community. The city was no longer a pea. Recognizing the urgency of the situation, the police department formed yet another task force dedicated to solving the string of murders. Police Chief H.F. Hopkins made a public promise. "We're going to crack this." The task force's detectives were ordered to leave no stone unturned, interrogating every potential suspect, from ex-convicts with extensive criminal records to freelance photographers with questionable behavior. The team worked tirelessly, chasing leads and interviewing individuals who might have any connection to the crimes. Despite their efforts, the investigation yielded no tangible results. Suspects were questioned and cleared, evidence was scrutinized but led to dead ends, and the task force was left without any breakthroughs. The lack of progress only deepened the frustration and despair felt by both the investigators and the families of the victims. However, there was one small silver lining. By the end of the investigation, the spate of violent crimes appeared to subside. It seemed as though the perpetrator, if there was indeed a single individual responsible for the wave of murders, had either retreated or moved on. The streets of Fort Worth became marginally quieter, but the lingering fear and unresolved cases left an indelible mark on the city. For Angela and Regina's families, as well as the families of other victims, the lack of closure was devastating. The holiday season, a time meant for celebration and togetherness, became a painful reminder of the loved ones they had lost. Each passing year brought renewed sorrow, as anniversaries of the murders resurfaced questions and grief. The lives of the victims, young women with promising futures, were cruelly stolen, leaving a void that could never be filled. The community's unease persisted. The possibility that a serial killer had roamed their streets, targeting women without rhyme or reason, left a scar on Fort Worth's collective psyche. Women continued to take extra precautions, altering their routines, avoiding poorly lit areas, and arming themselves in case of an attack. The fear may have lessened over time, but it never entirely disappeared. For law enforcement, the unresolved cases served as a grim reminder of the challenges of their profession. Detectives worked under immense pressure, determined to deliver justice, but the tools and technology of the time were not in their favor. Without the advantages of modern forensic science, such as DNA analysis, investigators relied on traditional methods and community tips, which often led to frustrating dead ends. Although the task force eventually disbanded, the detectives who had worked on the cases carried the burden of their failure. The haunting questions: who was responsible? Why were these women targeted? Could the murders have been prevented? Continued to weigh heavily on their minds. The fear of another outbreak of violence loomed, even as the city tried to move forward. The murders of Angela, Regina, and the other women left a legacy of sorrow and resilience in Fort Worth. The city's residents, particularly its women, learned to adapt to a world where safety could no longer be taken for granted. Self-defense classes became more common, conversations about personal security became routine, and the community rallied together in mutual support. Despite the passage of time, the memories of those harrowing days remain vivid. Angela and Regina's stories are etched into the history of Fort Worth, serving as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the enduring human spirit. While the mystery of their deaths may never be fully resolved, the determination of their families and the community to seek justice and honor their memories ensures that their lives, though tragically cut short, will never be forgotten. On February 24, 1986, a passerby made a grim discovery. The naked body of a woman, partially wrapped in a blanket, was found on a hillside near a park in central Fort Worth. She had been strangled, but police were unable to identify her using conventional methods such as fingerprints or dental records. To complicate matters, there were no missing persons reports that matched her description, leaving investigators with no clear leads. As time passed, the trail grew cold. Months turned into years, and it seemed as though the unidentified man responsible for these heinous crimes had finally disappeared for good. The community, still haunted by the past, slowly began to heal. But for Jim Walker, the younger brother of Carla Walker, the quest for justice never ended. After graduating from Western Hills High School, Jim enrolled at Sam Houston State University. However, his time there was cut short when he was diagnosed with a congenital eye condition that forced him to leave college. Determined to make a life for himself, Jim found work as a security guard at a local office of the defense contractor General Dynamics. Yet even as he built a career and moved forward with his life, Jim never stopped hunting for the man who had taken his sister's life. When Jim's father, Leighton, passed away from a heart attack in 1987, Jim inherited his father's metal box filled with meticulously kept notes about Carla's case. These notes, documenting names, addresses, and potential leads, became Jim's roadmap as he continued his search for answers. After his mother passed away in 2015, Jim purchased his childhood home and moved back in with his wife, determined to stay rooted in Texas, close to where it all began. Jim's resilience caught the attention of two investigators, Wagner and Bennett, who reached out to him in the hopes of uncovering new witnesses and leads. The investigators utilized modern tools unavailable during the original investigation. They posted a message on the Fort Worth Police Department's Facebook page, asking for anyone with information about Carla's case to come forward. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of messages flooded in, including one from a woman who claimed her ex-husband had grown up in the same neighborhood as Carla. She reported that he had kept newspaper clippings about the case and often reread them, a potential red flag. While the woman strongly suspected her ex-husband's involvement, there was no concrete evidence linking him to the crime. Frustration mounted as yet another promising lead failed to deliver definitive answers. Still, Wagner and Bennett refused to give up. They turned their attention to an avenue of investigation that had been unavailable in the 1970s: DNA analysis. Fortunately, Carla's clothing from the night of her abduction, her dress and other garments, had been carefully preserved in paper bags and stored in the police department's evidence lab. This meticulous handling increased the likelihood that usable DNA samples could still be extracted, even after so many years. However, there were no guarantees. Time, exposure, and other factors could have degraded the DNA, potentially rendering it unusable. Despite this uncertainty, the team pressed forward, driven by a renewed sense of hope. As advancements in forensic technology opened new doors, Wagner and Bennett sought to use familial DNA analysis, a groundbreaking method that allows investigators to identify suspects by matching unknown DNA to that of a relative. This technique had solved numerous cold cases across the country and offered a glimmer of hope for finally identifying Carla's killer. While waiting for results, Jim Walker remained steadfast in his pursuit of justice. He combed through his father's notes, revisiting old leads and looking for anything that might have been overlooked. The emotional toll of the decades-long search was immense, but Jim's resolve never wavered. "I just want to see this person brought to justice," he said in a rare interview. "For my family, for Carla, and for the community, this can't remain a mystery forever." The renewed investigation gained attention, sparking discussions about unsolved cases in Texas. Podcasts and documentaries highlighted Carla's story, bringing it to a new generation of listeners. These platforms not only kept the case alive in the public eye, but also encouraged others to come forward with information, no matter how seemingly insignificant. As the DNA testing progressed, the team remained cautiously optimistic. The possibility of extracting a viable sample after so many years was uncertain, but the mere chance of a breakthrough was enough to sustain their efforts. For Jim, the potential for answers brought a mix of hope and apprehension. While the prospect of finally identifying the killer was tantalizing, it also meant revisiting the pain and trauma of losing his sister in such a horrific way. For the city of Fort Worth, Carla's case symbolized a chapter of unresolved sorrow. Her story, like those of the other victims, served as a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the devastating consequences of violence. Yet it also demonstrated the enduring power of determination and the relentless pursuit of justice. The advances in forensic science and the commitment of investigators like Wagner and Bennett offered a renewed sense of possibility, a chance to bring closure to a case that had haunted the community for decades. Even as the investigation continued, the specter of the unknown loomed large. The question that had plagued Fort Worth for years remained unanswered. Who was responsible? For Jim Walker, the answer couldn't come soon enough. Until then, he would remain vigilant, carrying forward the legacy of his father's quest for justice and honoring the memory of his beloved sister. The story began with Carla Walker, a case Paul Holes stumbled upon while browsing the internet. Intrigued, he decided to investigate further, interviewing Carla's siblings, Jim and Cindy, as well as a few of her friends. One of these friends shared fond memories of Carla, recalling her ever-present smile in the hallways at school. Although they hadn't been close, Carla's kindness left a lasting impression. Another individual who heard the interview was Diane Kuykendall, a former schoolmate. Diane reminisced about Carla's warmth, noting how her smiles always brightened her day. Diane expressed a wish. If only there were a way to cover the costs of advanced DNA testing on Carla's clothing, perhaps the case could finally be solved. That hope took a significant step forward when a California lab examined Carla's preserved clothing. The technicians discovered intact bodily fluids, uncontaminated despite the passage of decades. From these samples, they successfully developed a complete DNA profile, which they uploaded to CODIS, the nationwide law enforcement database containing millions of criminal profiles. However, CODIS produced no matches. Determined to explore other avenues, Holes and his team contacted a Texas laboratory specializing in genealogical mapping. Despite their expertise, the technicians there also came up empty-handed. The frustration was palpable, but the investigators refused to give up. Their persistence led them to revisit old suspects, including Glenn McCurley. McCurley had been questioned in 1974 after telling police his Ruger .22 pistol had been stolen 6 weeks before Carla's abduction. Detectives Wagner and Bennett decided to look into McCurley's background once more. Their research revealed little beyond his 1961 conviction for car theft at the age of 18. By 1986, McCurley had left his truck driving job and taken on part-time work as a handyman. At this point, he was battling cancer with a tumor on his liver the size of a quarter. When detectives visited the McCurley home, they found Glenn and his wife Judy still living in Fort Worth. Judy seemed uneasy, admitting that her husband wasn't in great health due to his cancer. McCurley greeted the detectives with a raspy voice, asking, "What do you want to talk about?" Wagner wasted no time explaining, "We're going back to 1974. You were living here then, so you may have heard about a young girl who was abducted from a bowling alley." Before Glenn could respond, Judy interjected, "I know exactly who you're talking about. Carla Walker." Judy appeared cooperative, hoping for answers. "You can take a DNA sample if that'll clear Glenn's name," she told the detectives. Glenn hesitated at first, but eventually agreed, signing a consent form and allowing Wagner to swab the inside of his cheek. Judy seemed conflicted as she watched the process unfold. "I hope you find out who did this," she said. "That girl deserves to be remembered as someone important." 11 days later, the DNA results came back. Technicians confirmed that the sample from McCurley's cheek matched the DNA found on Carla's clothing. The results were undeniable. On February 16, 1974, Glenn McCurley had been the one to abduct Carla Walker. When confronted, McCurley admitted to drinking whiskey and beer for hours that evening, driving aimlessly, and eventually parking at the bowling alley. For a moment, it seemed he might confess. Instead, McCurley spun a story about hearing a girl scream and intervening to help. He claimed to have opened the car door, only to see a big guy pulling Carla inside and slamming the door shut. The detectives didn't buy his version of events. The evidence was mounting, and it painted a clear picture. During a search of McCurley's home, police found his Ruger .22 pistol hidden in a compartment above a door, a gun he had claimed was stolen decades earlier. This critical piece of evidence further tied him to Carla's murder. 9 months later, on June 16, 2021, McCurley appeared in court for his preliminary hearing, arriving in a green prison uniform and being wheeled into the courtroom in a wheelchair. His trial began a few months later, and Carla's boyfriend, Rodney, testified about the night she was abducted. The courtroom heard harrowing details about the Ruger 22 and its connection to McCurley. On the third day of the trial, Glenn McCurley unexpectedly changed his plea to guilty. His admission shocked the courtroom, but it brought a measure of closure to a case that had haunted Fort Worth for decades. The judge wasted no time in sentencing McCurley to life in prison. Despite the conviction, lingering questions remained. Why had Glenn McCurley, a man with no history of violent crimes, committed such a heinous act? What drove him to target Carla Walker? For her family, these questions may never be fully answered. Jim Walker, who had spent decades searching for his sister's killer, finally found some solace in knowing that justice had been served. "It's been a long road," he said, "but we finally know the truth." For Fort Worth, Carla Walker's case stands as a testament to the power of perseverance, the advancements in forensic science, and the dedication of those who refuse to let the past remain buried. Her memory, once shrouded in mystery, now serves as a beacon of hope for other cold cases waiting to be solved.